Today, as I am filming this, it is July 1st, which means that June is over, which means that Red, White, and June has ended, sadly, which means that it is time to talk about what I read for Red, White, and June. So here we go. Welcome to my channel. My name is Anne. This is In Search of Wonder, and Red, White, and June is one of my favorite readathons that I have participated in a while. In part because this year is the 250th anniversary of the independence of the United States of America, which is just fun and exciting all around, and I really enjoyed reading all about that time in history. In fact, which is unusual for me, in the month of June, I limited my reading entirely to Revolutionary War era books, fiction and nonfiction, to go along with the Red, White, and June Readathon. I do not normally read thematically, and consequently, as a result, I ended up reading books that were a lot on my Kindle. Only a couple of them actually came from my shelves. So typically, I like to read more from my shelves than getting books even from the library or buying them on Kindle or whatever. But I did make an exception this month because I really wanted to read thematically, and I had a marvelous time, so it was a month well spent in terms of reading. Let's talk about what I read and how I fit it into each of the prompts. I read a total of 8 books in the month of June, and actually 2 of them, to be fair, were not on topic. So the one was part of a reading project for myself that I had planned for the summer, and the other one was part of a reading project I had started in May but hadn't quite finished, so it carried over into June. So those were not part of my Red, White, and June TBR, but the other 6 books that I read definitely were, and actually I still have 2 books in progress that I'm going to talk about as well that will fit into these prompts and into this readathon. And so we're just carrying it through this first week of July because Saturday, after all, is July 4th and is the reason we're celebrating this in the first place. So I'm going to include those books as well in my conversation. To begin with, the prompts for Red, White, and June were a fiction book set in the Revolutionary era and a nonfiction book. And then those you could apply however you wanted to the following prompts, but I read enough books that I have something for each of those categories. So the other prompts are Secrets or Spies, Loyalist or Patriot, Quill and Parchment, Faith That Endures, and Courage in Petticoat. So I'm going to start backwards and work my way up and talk about Courage in Petticoat first, and the book that I ended up deciding to put in that slot. Now, disclaimer, I actually, over here where I tracked all the books that I read for this challenge, the title of the book is in red, and then the blue is all the prompts that they fit. And you can see that the majority of the books fit the majority of the prompts, if not most of them. So each book could go for almost any of these slots for the most part. A lot of the books in the Revolutionary War era dealt with all of these topics in one way or another. But in the end, I fit one to each of them, and so I will talk about that. So Courage in Petticoat. This one, and I read it on my Kindle, was definitely The Belle of Chatham by Laura Frantz. Now, Laura Frantz writes books that are mostly set in the colonial era and the Revolutionary era. She has very few books that are not set in that time frame. Specifically in the Revolutionary era, she does have several as well. So The Belle of Chatham is one, and she wrote it particularly for the 250th anniversary of America's independence. And so that was a high priority for me to read this month, and I'm so glad that I did. I did enjoy it overall, and I really, really loved our main character, the Belle of Chatham, as she's called. So she lived in Chatham, New Jersey, but throughout the story, she moves to New York, a fort in New York, and then she also moves to Virginia, which is my stomping grounds. So she starts out in New Jersey, but she moves from there. First of all, I've not read any books set in New Jersey, so I'm going to be able to color off that state in my United States map, which is exciting, of books, that I've read set in those different states. But Also, I just really loved how she went through different stages of the war throughout 1775 and 1776, and then a little further than that, actually. I think that a lot of the time was spent in 1777 as well. Anyway, so there's battle in New York, and a lot of the soldiers are staging and prepping in New Jersey, preparing to fight in New York. And so we go through some of the key battles that took place in the state of New York. For a time, our character lives in New York at one of the forts before escaping south to Virginia for safety. Now, as for the actual story, so that's the revolutionary setting. As to the actual story, our main character, Belle is her name. She and her sister are living alone in their house in Chatham, New Jersey, because their parents have both passed away. And they have multiple brothers in the area or in New York. And one of her brothers is a soldier and brings some other soldiers from the Continental Army to billet at their house in Chatham, New Jersey. And so she gets to meet this captain of a Virginia regiment or troop. And so, long story short, they fall in love, they end up getting married, and she moves with him to the fort in New York. And so we get a glimpse into their married life there, and not only early married life, but just added complications of living in a fort and fighting in a war and everything that's going on politically at the time as well as personally in their lives. Part of the story is that there are divided loyalties in the family. So Belle is a patriot along with most of her siblings and her husband, of course, but her sister is not. Her sister is a loyalist. And so there are secrets and there are spies, so it could go for that prompt as well. But I felt like our character Belle demonstrated exemplary courage throughout the story in first marrying this man who is a captain and who is I don't know what the right word is. It's not coming to my mind, but almost fearless. You know, he puts himself in harm's way. Like, he's not afraid to do anything to fight the enemy. And so marrying someone like that takes a deal of courage in the first place. But on top of that, as she is eventually pregnant and she's expecting a child, so for her safety, because their fort is going to be under attack, her husband sends her down to Virginia to his family, to relative safety there. She makes that journey through the wilderness, because at that time it was a literally wilderness. There was no highways there at that time to get you from New York to Virginia. There was no train system. My husband and I took the train to New York last week. It took us 3 to 4 hours on the train, easy peasy, lemon squeezy. It was not like that back then, especially 2 women traveling alone, one of them pregnant, through the woods on horseback. You had the dangers of the Native Americans or who knows what other kinds of people hiding in the woods for whatever reason. And then you had the dangers of the wildlife, which they had to deal with, plus the danger of getting lost and the danger of being out in the elements, at the mercy of the elements. So it was a very dangerous journey, and that honestly was probably my favorite part of the book, and the courage that she and her traveling companion showed. These 2 women traveling alone through the wilderness down to safety in Virginia, where they both were from. Her friend was originally from Virginia. She was going to Virginia, where her husband was from. So anyway, that was kind of a long synopsis of the story, but that's why I placed that in The Courage in Petticoats. So I do recommend it. I will say that Laura Frantz's narration style isn't always my favorite. She has a tendency to skip over things that happen, but then refer back to them as if she had mentioned it. And so there's kind of like this, like, I don't know. I feel like it could be done really well. And I think sometimes she does it really well in her books because I don't even notice it. But sometimes I do notice it and it catches me off guard. And another thing is that sometimes issues get resolved that she doesn't even take you through how they are resolved. So it seems convenient. So there are a couple of things that I dislike a little bit about her narrative style, but I really love the characters in this story. I love the setting, and I loved the whole sequence of everything that took place in the story and how it worked out. And so it was definitely worthwhile reading, and I'm glad I read that for Red, White, and June. So then for Faith That Endures, I have a bit of an interesting pick here, and this I do have a hard copy. So that is Phillis Wheatley, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral. Phillis Wheatley was a Black poet who was enslaved in Massachusetts in the late 1700s, and she lived in Boston with her master and his family during the time of the Revolution. So she was a poet, and she ended up being a published poet as well. And she was very well educated by her master's family. So eventually she was given her freedom. But unfortunately for her, at that point, because of everything happening with the war and everything, her life did not quite turn out ideally, actually. There's a bit of a tragic end to her story. And that makes me a little bit sad. But she did have, up until that point, up until the war happened, it seemed like she had just the perfect life ahead of her, an amazing, wonderful life. And she had published a book of poetry. She was well educated. She was well loved. She was appreciated by everyone. And unfortunately, it ended so sadly for her. But this was written at the peak. And so we get to see her brilliant mind at work and her absolutely stunning grasp of the English language, especially considering it was not her native language. She did not learn English until she was 7 or 8 years old. Her grasp of the classical education that she received, and it was just amazing. I loved her poetry. It was very accessible, and yet it was also coming from a place of someone with a high level of intelligence and a high level of education and learning, and also someone with a really good heart, it just seemed like. And I put this in the slot for Faith That Endures because her faith is very evident in these poems. And she writes some about Greek mythology, as would be expected from someone with a classical education like she had. But she also writes, everything is imbued with her faith in Christ and her understanding of scripture, which was equal to or surpassed her understanding of Greek mythology as well. It's just woven into all of her poetry, and it was just really beautiful. So Phillis Wheatley's Poems on Various Subjects, I highly recommend for anyone who's interested in poetry, whether you love poetry for itself or you want to read more poetry. I highly recommend Phillis Wheatley's poetry as a stop for you along the way on your journey of reading poetry. And then for Quill and Parchment, another book I read on my Kindle, which I got for 99 cents, I believe, on Amazon. And that is The Power of Sympathy by William H. Brown. And I have talked a lot about it in my reading vlogs. I'll just give a little bit of the synopsis of the story. So the story opens out with two young men writing letters to each other. And we come to find out through the course of the story that they both have a love interest. But the one initially, because she is so beneath him in terms of class or whatever, he is at first thinking that he's going to make her his mistress. But then his conscience smites him. And also he, I think, recognizes that she would never agree to such a thing. And that's part of why he loves her, because she is so good. He comes to the realization through the course of the story that he cannot do that to her. If he is going to have her, he is going to give her his life and commit his life to her. So in doing that, he has to go against the wishes of his family, but he is determined to do that. So that is contrasted with some backstories of other people in the story, some other characters in the story who did not make such wise choices. And so this book is really about morality and purity in the sense of men taking advantage of women in particular, and the reasons that happens, and who's to blame for it, and the consequences of it. And we're comparing and contrasting multiple different stories, some of them fictional, some of them real, historic instances. And there's a lot of conversation in the book about this whole issue and this whole topic. But the reason I put it in Quill and Parchment is because it is entirely written in epistolary format. There are letters exchanged by, I guess, between 4 and 5 different characters. We are also introduced to other characters. We never see their letters or their correspondence, but they are written about in the letters that we do get to read. So we hear about a variety of different people in the story, but we're reading them from the letters of 4 to 5 different people who are all corresponding with each other. It was really interesting. It's considered the first American novel, so it was actually an excellent choice to read for Red, White, and June. It just fit everything, all of the themes so perfectly. And I actually really enjoyed it. I think that there was a decent amount of moralizing in this story. One character who kind of served as a mentor to another one, and her letters were a little bit didactic and a little bit preachy in their tone because she was trying to teach her little mentee, well, not little mentee, she was a grown woman, but a lot of it, I felt like it just came naturally in the flow of the letters. But I do think it's not like a popular classic today because of that aspect. And I think also because modern society would probably not agree with some of the morals that were being espoused by the author of this story and the characters in this story, much to the shame of modern society, actually. So it was very good. I will say the thing that is most interesting about this book is that there is a twist. Now, if you have your eyes open and you're paying attention and reading between the lines, you know what the twist is. You know what's coming. But yeah, there is a big twist in the story, so that makes it for an interesting read, again, in my opinion. I think more people should read it than have read it. I can see why it wouldn't be like the most popular classic American novel ever or the great American novel, but it's definitely worth a read. Then for Loyalist or Patriot, I read the book Spark of the Revolution by Megan Soja, which I was very excited to read because I did not think at the beginning of the month that I would be able to. I wanted to, but I couldn't get my hands on it anywhere without paying full price for it, which I was loath to do. So I, in the end, was able to get Kindle Unlimited for Amazon Prime Days. So I was able to read that, The Spark of the Revolution. And I put that for Loyalist or Patriot because that is a really key theme in this story. There's a blended family where a father and his son and daughter had been living in England. They come to Boston where he is after their mother dies. And they're grown, like they're young adults. And in the meantime, unbeknownst to them, he has married a widow and her daughter, who is like a teenager.
Editing in here to say that he married the widow who had a daughter. He did not marry the widow and the daughter. Just wanted to clarify that little bit.
And so this blended family is trying to make it work. And all of them except the father, they are patriots, but they kind of keep their feelings on the down low because the dad is staunchly loyalist. The children, they're coming from England. They don't really have a dog in this fight, so to speak. But as we go through the story, they kind of have to take their side. And the young man who has kind of kept on top of all of the things that are happening has already been intellectually leaning towards the side of the Patriots. But as he is in Boston and befriends some people who are Sons of Liberty, etc., he also begins to get emotionally invested in the Patriot cause. And our female character, who is the main focus of the story, Patience is her name, she gradually becomes more and more convinced on the side of the Patriots as well. So they have to make this decision, and it's a key part of the story. And then as they have decided to become more and more involved in the Patriot cause, as Patience is falling in love with a staunch Patriot, they have to deal with their loyalties being put in opposition against their father, who is a staunch loyalist and who isn't honestly a very nice person. And he is not very happy with them for having these patriot tendencies. And then I do like the way all of that ends up being resolved. I feel like that was well done on the part of the author. So I chose that for Loyalist or Patriot. And it was a good book. It was an enjoyable read. It was kind of like just honestly forgettable in the long run, but it was enjoyable while I read it. I highly recommend it if you enjoy historical romance and you want to read something set in that era. It's a good choice. So then for Secrets or Spies, I'm going with The Captive Heart by Michelle Griep, which is the first book that I read for actual Red, White, and June. And that one has, again, we have a female character coming from England. So she doesn't really know the ins and outs of Patriots versus Loyalists. She marries a man, basically he purchased her as an indentured slave, but he didn't want an indentured servant. He wanted a wife to help take care of his child because he was a widower. And so she came to help him with that. And so they ended up getting married as a marriage of convenience. But, of course, in the end, they fall in love with each other as well. He is staunchly a patriot. And he, in fact, as the Secrets and Spies goes, he is working as a spy. And this is in is it Virginia, North Carolina? Anyway, it's further south. Most of the books that I read this month were set in like Boston and northern, like New York and stuff. But this was one that was set in the South. He was a spy, and he also was part Native American. So there was that whole element of the story as well, how that all tied into the American Revolution and different loyalties that the different tribes had. And the information that he got from them and whatever. So he did some spying, but also secrets works because he definitely kept some secrets from his wife. Not because he was doing anything nefarious or because he was a bad person, but because he didn't trust her with his secrets. And more than that, he just didn't think she needed to know. And yet she's over here, hurt because she doesn't understand some of the things that he's doing, because he's not explaining why he's doing them. So there's a lot of secrets that are layered here that form the conflicts that happen in the course of the story. And so I always enjoy Michelle Griep's writing. This is probably not my favorite book by her, but I did enjoy it. And it was a unique setting as far as, and unique causes of conflict as far as Revolutionary era books go. So I did enjoy that one. So then the nonfiction about the Revolutionary era, I actually still have that in progress. So 1776, and I am enjoying it overall. I will say I would prefer, for my own personal taste, I would prefer more about the actual people involved. Now, not that we don't get any of that, like we do. He's definitely giving us background information about these people and information about their lives and their personal lives. We're seeing glimpses into their letters and their correspondence and all of that. So it's not like it doesn't have any of that in it, but I would rather it be about the people than about the actual battles. But we're definitely getting a lot of information about the battles and about strategy and about what the British Army is doing and what the Continental Army is doing and Washington's role as commander-in-chief. And we're seeing him a lot particularly in that light, in that role. The problem with that for me personally is that I dislike battle scenes and I dislike battle talk and I dislike strategy and all of that stuff. This is just not what I like to read about. Around here where I live, we have a lot of Civil War battlefields. I've also been to many Revolutionary era battlefields. There are some of those around here too. Even when I'm standing there, even like in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where you can go up to a lookout tower and you can observe the whole battlefield, that's the closest I get to understanding the strategy of how battle back then worked. But generally speaking, I just can't wrap my brain around it, around the spatial element of it, the geographical element of it, and where different armies are and how the battle is. I don't understand it, and so it frustrates me, and it takes more brain power than I prefer to invest in a book on this subject. Like I don't even care that much in the end. You know what I'm saying? Like it takes a lot to understand it, but I don't even like why do I not need to understand the ins and outs of the battle and why this side won and this side didn't and where they went wrong, all of that stuff. Just tell me who won at the end. That's all I need to know. Tell me about the people involved, about their lives, about what they were thinking, how they were feeling, what their relationships with their families were like, what they did after the war, what they did before the war, their internal conflicts. That's what I want to know about. I don't really want to know about the battle. So there's a lot of battle talk in this one. It's not my favorite thing personally, but I am otherwise enjoying the book. I'm learning a lot, so I'm appreciating it from that perspective. I do find that David McCullough jumps around a little bit in his narrative from topic to topic, from person to person, from time to time, which really annoys me. I really much prefer to go like linearly through time. And he is, but then he isn't. So it kind of makes it difficult for me to follow. So I'm not 100% loving this, but that's not to say it's not a good book. It's just not the sort of reading that I usually would prefer to do on a nonfiction subject. But I'm going to read it. I'm enjoying it. I'm halfway through, and yeah, I'm learning a lot. It's a good book. So that goes for my nonfiction read for the month. Just put in the fictional story set in the Revolutionary era. I have Hang a Thousand Trees with Ribbons by Anne Rinaldi, which was a book for my shelf, but I have put it on Penguin already, so I don't have it in my hands at the moment. But that one is about Phillis Wheatley, whose poetry I read. And otherwise, it didn't really fit in any of the other prompts. It was set in the Revolutionary era time. And so the author imagines how Phillis Wheatley handled all of that, being a newly arrived slave from Africa and dealing with all of these changes. How did it affect her personally and her role, and how it affected her poetry, etc. So that was very interesting from that perspective, but I did have some issues with the book. I felt like the author, Anne Rinaldi, took liberties with the person of Phillis Wheatley and made her something that she wasn't, as far as anybody can tell from what is left of her poetry and what we know of her. I think that she read into her far too much. So that was my finishes up the prompts. I do have one more book in progress, Worth the Risk, I think, or something like that, by T. Elizabeth Renich. And again, this is another Kindle Unlimited book that I am able to access. And I realized after I started reading the book, and then I read the blurb about the author, I was like, wait a second, I have met this author. So she is a local to me. She lives somewhere in Virginia. And I don't know exactly where, maybe like the Williamsburg area, but she's localish to me. She was at a local authors event that I went to with my sister. And I remember meeting her there, and she used to work for the Redskins team. And then I don't know if she retired from that, but she left that job, and then she's writing. And I think that she publishes independently. I'm not 100% sure about that. But she has a couple of different series. So I was like, oh, that's so cool. I actually remember meeting her, and now I'm reading this book. So I am enjoying the book. I feel a little bit like the author is trying really hard to emulate the way that people would have spoken back at that time. In the late 1700s, the story is starting out in England, in Bath, England. And I think she's really working very hard to emulate that. But I think that, I don't know, there's maybe an overshooting of the mark. Like it's a little bit too much. And I do feel like some phrases, like for example, Diamond of the First Water is talking about a woman. That's a phrase that refers to a woman on the marriage market. But she uses it to refer to a man. And I'm not 100% sure, but I don't think that ever would have been used in that way. And there are some other places where I feel like the vocabulary is like not quite used correctly. And I'm a big word girl. So this is the sort of stuff that I pick up on. So I don't know if other people would find that to be true as well. Maybe I'm just a little bit extra picky, but that's the only thing that I have disliked about it. Also, I did not realize how long it was. It is 382 pages, which isn't crazy long, but it is like longer than usual for like, it just wasn't what I was expecting. I was expecting like more like Spark of the Revolution, like a shorter, I don't know, like that sort of thing. But it's definitely much more in-depth. We're getting a lot of groundwork laid right now in the first few chapters that I'm reading, and a lot of backstory, and the actual Revolutionary era part of it hasn't even started yet. Okay, so I ran out of storage, so I caught off somewhere, I don't know where. But anyways, that book I am reading and overall enjoying for the most part. That is my Red, White, and June reading. I really enjoyed spending the month focusing on the Revolutionary War era, and I just want to thank Shannon at Old American Spirit for organizing this and for all the co-hosts in hosting it. And I just really had a great time. And even though next year is not the 250th anniversary, I hope that we do it again because it was a lot of fun. I did read, as I said, a couple of other books that were unrelated to Red, White, and June. One is And the Dead Shall Rise by Steve Oney, which I talked about already a lot, and How to Read a Book, which I've also talked a lot about. Both of those were nonfiction books, and that's another reason why I haven't quite finished this, because I normally am only reading one nonfiction at a time, and this month I had 3 impresses. Like, who am I even? That was a lot for me, and it was a lot to get those books finished, and then to also be reading another nonfiction. So that's why now I'm finally able to focus on this because I am finished with the other 2. Let me just mention real quick some of the other goals and things and challenges that I'm working on and how I did with my reading in terms of those. So for my yearly challenges, for my Reading the Classics challenge, I read The Power of Sympathy by William Brown, and that was for the prompt set in the USA. So that one, what the setting, like the particular place in the USA wasn't really prominent because it was all epistolary and it wasn't really a huge part of it. However, it was definitely very much American in the ideals and a lot of the dialogue, the conversation the characters were having with each other, the things that were on their minds. And it is often considered the very first American, truly American novel that was written for that reason. So I feel like it fits for that. For Almost Journey Through Time, I switched her June and July prompts. Her July prompt was to read about the American Revolution. So I did that in June. And I chose for that one, The Belle of Chatham by Laura Frantz. So that fit for hers. And then for Jeanette's Christian fiction bingo, she had a book set in Tennessee or in the South and a 5-star prediction. So The Captive Heart by Michelle Griep, as I said, was set in the South. I think it was North Carolina, not South Carolina, or not Tennessee. But that one was, or maybe South Carolina. That makes more sense. Yeah, so The Captive Heart by Michelle Griep. And then the other one was a 5-star prediction, which was The Belle of Chatham by Laura Frantz, which was not quite 5 stars, but it was very good. And then for Chantel's Read Your Shelf Challenge, the prompt was a title with 5 or more words. And so hang 1,000 trees with ribbons, hang 1,000 trees with ribbons. 6 letters, 6 words, I mean. So that fit for that. Here is my book tracker for the year, and there are my June reads. I was only able to add one book right up from my shelf this month. As I said, I read a lot of Kindle, so or maybe there was 2 that were from my shelf. For nonfiction reads, I was able to add 2, and I will add a third one, 1776, when I am finished with it. But that's a lot. So this year I read 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 nonfiction, which is really good because normally I average about 1 a month, maybe slightly more, but having read 10 in 6 months is actually really good for me. And I did have 1 DNF, and that was Ragtime by E.L. Doctorow, but I saw the musical and the musical was really good. So I have not done any of my rereads. I had a lot of rereads that I wanted to get to this year, and I have not done any of them. And I don't know when I will, honestly. Here is my June spread of the books that I read. For Tiffany's summer book bingo, I do not have anywhere near a bingo yet, which is just silly. But I do have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 books marked off all together on her summer book bingo. So that's not too bad. So for the prompt challenging, I chose And the Dead Shall Rise, just because it was so long and dense and full of details. And then for series, I put Spark of the Revolution because that is book 1 in a series. I don't know if I will read the rest of them or not, probably eventually. Then for Trailblazing, I chose Hang 1,000 Trees with Ribbons because Phillis Wheatley was trailblazing. She was the first Black woman to publish a book of poetry in the United States. And then for Crisis, I chose The Power of Sympathy because there is a crisis that happens in that book. That's the plot twist I was telling you about earlier. Definitely a crisis. And then from your shelves, I chose How to Read a Book, the nonfiction that I read, because that was indeed on my shelf. And then off the grid, I chose The Captive Heart because those characters in that story, like, they're truly homesteading. Something had happened to the man in the story, and so he moved out into his property in the middle of nowhere and built a life from scratch there. And so when his wife comes from England and she's from a very proper background and she comes to live there, yeah, it's a big adjustment for her. So they live off the grid for sure. I mean, there wasn't a grid back then, but whatever grid there was, they didn't live on it. All right, so then a new to you setting. And so I read The Belle of Chatham because it was set in New Jersey, which was a new setting for me. And then the last one was essay, play, or poetry, and I put on there poems by Phillis Wheatley. So for Chantel's Passport to Summer Reading, I got a few of those. Wings, I chose The Captive Heart by Michelle Griep, and the reason why is because the main character, her husband nicknames her Redbird. Well, it's like her Native American name because he's also Native American, so he gives her a name, and he calls her Redbird. For Journey, I picked The Belle of Chatham because, as I mentioned, she takes that long journey from New York all the way down to Virginia through the woods on horseback with only another woman for company. And then for the 5 W's, I chose And the Dead Shall Rise because a journalist is digging into the story and asking all of the questions about what happened, who was involved, what were their motivations, when was the timeline for the details of different things to happen, trying to figure out who actually committed the crime and why, all of this stuff, why some of the people did some of the things that they did. Definitely digs into all the who, what, where, when, why, and very fascinating read. For trees, I chose, for obvious reasons, Hang 1,000 Trees with Ribbons by Rinaldi. And then finally for books, I chose How to Read a Book. I mean, that's what the title says, right? So that was my reading in June and all that I accomplished for the Red, White, and June, plus my other little bit of reading that I did. Let me know in the comments, did you participate in Red, White, and June? And what was your favorite book that you read, if so? Or even if you didn't participate in Red, White, and June, what was your favorite book in June? Did you enjoy the readathon? And I will see you next time. Bye.